Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today for our April NRRI webinar about advancing energy storage in the states. I'm Tom Stanton, Principal Researcher for the National Regulatory Research Institute. I will introduce the topic, and then I'm going to turn over the controls to Honorable James P. Griffin, who goes by the name Jay Griffin, who is the Chairman of the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission. We're going to ask you to type your questions into the questions tab, which is part of the GoToWebinar control panel. You should see that over on the right-hand side of your screen. And anytime during the discussion today, please type in your questions. I'll be monitoring the questions and can gather them together so that we'll leave plenty of time at the end of the presentations for you to get your questions addressed. I also want to mention that we are planning to do a second webinar on the same topic of energy storage, maybe diving deeper into different technical aspects of storage. So we really would appreciate you sending us your questions either now during the session or after the session. And if you will send us your questions and concerns, then that will help us to plan a follow-up webinar also about energy storage. We can see that this topic is of great interest, and we're getting a very, very good turnout today from many, many of the states, and we thank all of the commissioners and commission staff who have come to the webinar today. I also want to welcome all of our neighbors from Canada and Mexico and Puerto Rico. We see many, many people signing on today from those areas, and we appreciate your interest too. So I'm going to turn over the broadcast now to Commissioner Griffin, and he will be the moderator for today's session, and we'll introduce the panelists one by one. I want to introduce Commissioner Griffin and let you know that he has a PhD in policy analysis from the University of California, Santa Barbara, a joint master's degree in environmental management and public policy from Duke University, and a BA in political economy from Williams College. He was appointed to be the Public Utilities Commission from Governor Ige in May 2017 for a term that will expire at June 30th, 2022. And before he joined the commission, Commissioner Griffin was a faculty member at the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute, that is an independent research institute with the University of Hawaii that conducts many different kinds of clean energy research and development activities. So I encourage you anytime you get the chance to go visit the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute and the Hawaii Commission. Thank you for joining us today, Chair Griffin, and I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for that warm welcome, and aloha, everyone. We have an exciting topic today, and I think that's shown by the participation. As I understand it, we have near record participation, particularly in the diversity of people, both geographically and across industry. And that's expected. We have a stellar group of panelists. And just to quickly tick down, Aman will be talking about providing a very up-to-date current, in my view, technical market survey of energy storage technologies, particularly with a focus on with the implications for regulation and for regulators in the audience. Our second presentation will come from Jeremy Twitchell from the Pacific Northwest National Labs, and they'll have a specific focus on applications of energy storage, modern applications in utility planning, integrated resources planning, and distribution planning. Third up, we have Nitin Goldberger from the Energy Storage Association, and she'll be giving us an up-to-date view of energy storage policy in the states from the perspective of the association. And last but not least is one of our staff members here at the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, Clary Schaefer, and she'll talk about some of the most current decisions and applications of storage we've had here in Hawaii, both at the utility scale on the distribution level And just to offer a little bit of perspective, energy storage has been a very critical tool in helping our state meet its renewable energy goals. If, my experience goes back about 10 years as our clean energy initiative got started. We had early applications of storage that helped us integrate wind on the islands of Maui and Oahu. A few years after that, as the island of Kauai went very aggressively into lower cost utility scale storage, they're very innovative in pairing storage with those projects to both help with the grid balancing needs and shift energy storage into the evening. Most recently, we've had a historic set of projects here across the rest of the state, which Clarice will talk about, both from a cost standpoint, but some of the contractual provisions are worth paying attention to throughout the industry. We'll also be talking about, I think, one statistic that sticks out if we look at our customer side, the most recent statistic I saw is over 3/4 of all new systems sold in this island last year, customer rooftop storage were paired with storage. So really, it's been a key tool here and likely only increasing in its importance. What we're looking at in the next few years are retirement of some baseload units, fairly substantial size for our islands on Oahu and Maui. And I think pairings of energy storage and all of its applications would be critical to replacing those tools. And Clarice will talk more about that. And with no further ado, that's just our perspective here. And we want to get right into the material because we have a great set of presentations. Aman is up first. He's a manager with RMI. He works with government, private sector clients on identifying strategies to transition in a clean energy system. He's led multiple thought papers and research projects on mobility systems, electricity generation, and distribution, and climate change. He's worked RMI has worked both with government, private sector private government and private sector stakeholders in India, as well as worked with RMI's E-Lab, supporting work with the New York Rev and Fort Collins Climate Action Plan. With that, I'll let him take over, and we'll march through the rest of our presenters here. And as Tom said, please, for those in the audience, please put your questions in, and we'll sort through them and offer them up to our panelists here. So thank you very much, and look forward to the webinar here.
Great. Thank you, NRRI, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm in Chitkara, and I'm very excited to be here and share some of our emerging results from our new work on batteries. Just to give you a little bit of context, this is a global effort that talks about the significance of batteries across multiple industries and geographies. And this report is due to be published in a few weeks, but I'm happy to speak with you all about this particular work. And if there are any follow-up questions, I would love to follow up with you. So just speaking about, the significance of batteries, what we've seen and what we continue to see is that batteries will have a significant role in the energy system transformation, as well as multiple sectors of the economy, whether we're talking about mobility, the electric grid, consumer electronics, or some emerging and niche applications like aviation and maritime transportation. Just to give you some examples around, the kind of impact that batteries could have on these sectors. Batteries already represent 25 to 40% of EV costs, and that proportion could change quite significantly. So a $1 billion market can have an impact on a multi-billion-dollar sector. Going to the next slide here, what we think about, how the choice of battery technologies and chemistry and architecture. Some of these choices will have significant downstream implications on product design and upstream implications on infrastructure planning as well. Batteries, of course, will for example, help think a little bit about, what the mileage, what the charging requirements for different vehicles would be, and hence where charging and swapping infrastructure could be located, and hence what the effect on urban planning and city design will be, where we need substation improvements and investments in infrastructure, and then thinking a little bit about the electric grid, where natural gas pipelines or transmission pipelines will need to be built, and even going further and thinking long term about electric aviation and electric maritime transportation, where airports of the future could be built, what impact that will have on urban design and city design. Going on to the next slide here, we believe, given the importance of batteries in energy transformation as well as the economy, there are multiple reasons to think why certain breakthrough technologies might be feasible, might be achievable within the near to midterm future. Thinking a little bit about investments in battery startups worldwide, which were at about $1.5 billion in the third quarter of 2018, to talking about government investments and interest in alternative battery technologies, as well as some of these new financial instruments. Let me talk about a couple of these in more detail, particularly around government's interest in some of these new alternative battery technologies, as well as how a diverse set of players are starting to invest in battery technologies. Moving on, governments across the world, whether it's Japan or Europe, Germany and France, or India, are taking a serious and significant interest in battery technology advancements. That comes from a need to secure mineral supplies. It comes from a need to prioritize energy security, and it also comes from a need to maintain competitive edge in this rapid economic transformation that we're seeing globally. To talk about a couple of examples here, Japan recently formed this consortium called LibTech, which includes material companies, battery companies, and auto companies, to try and work on a solid-state battery of the future that could increase range of e-vehicles by about 30-odd%, going from 550 kilometers now to 800 kilometers in the future. India, a country that RMI has been working with over the last several years now, forecasts that its battery demand could be as high as 670 gigawatt hour in mobility and stationary applications. Europe, again, is taking a significant interest in battery manufacturing, with Sweden having already bankrolled a new battery manufacturing facility. And Germany and France have jumped in the fray as well, talking a little bit about investing in new battery manufacturing facilities in their countries. And thinking about the situation closer to home here in the US, ARPA-E and ARA have also played a key role in battery technology innovation here. We've noticed how early investments in battery technology innovation, funded by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, allowed multiple new storage patents and multiple new storage technologies to begin to be prototyped and now commercialized. Just looking at the trend in patents as a result of some of these DOE and ARPA-E investments, we've noticed a roughly 10-time increase between 2012 and 2017. And that IP is extremely valuable, again, thinking about broader economic advantage as well as energy system transformation. Moving on to the next slide here, talking about the diversity of investors in this space. In the top row here, we see some auto OEMs. including Volkswagen, BMW, Hyundai, and some of these new and emerging auto OEMs, including Dyson and Bosch, who've invested in multiple new and emerging battery technology firms, as well as your utilities, including NRRI, BEV, which is a new philanthropic investment firm, as well as traditional battery manufacturers. And most interestingly, oil and gas companies have also taken interest in some of these new and advanced battery technologies. The interests and incentives of these companies are very diverse and very interesting. Just to give you an example, a few days ago, the head of Shell New Energies, a new business unit within Shell that focuses on new and clean energy alternatives, talked about how electrification and hence batteries are core to the survival of the organization. You know, they see some of these new technologies as the means to keep their business going in the coming few years. So moving on, I know there's been a whole lot of skepticism around how we might not see new and emerging technologies anytime in the next decade. That lithium-ion batteries would essentially corner out any innovation, and that similar to solar, we will see consolidation of technologies and one cost curve. I don't want to talk about this slide too much, but I think the key message to take away from this slide is the fact that solar and batteries serve very different purposes. You know, the sole purpose of solar is to generate electrons, more or less. Batteries, however, can serve a diverse set of services. RMI's paper in 2015 identified at least 13 such services for the electric grid. But even in mobility, there are several other services that batteries can provide. So just thinking about that, we believe that there would be a diverse set of applications and battery technologies that you would see in the future. So what does that mean in terms of costs? And this is on the next slide here. We see that some of these new battery technologies will begin to compete with lithium-ion. Right now, lithium-ion is the be-all, end-all of battery technologies, and it's kind of emerging as the sole carrier. But we expect that multiple new technologies, some of which we surveyed, including advanced lithium-ion, solid-state, metal-air, lithium-sulfur, liquid metal, and flow, will start to result in significantly lower costs in the near future. We modeled a couple of scenarios. One is the incremental scenario, which forecasts or puts that number if improvements in these battery technologies are only incremental in nature. And then the other scenario is the disruptive scenario, which is trying to say how things might advance if some of these technologies were to reach their full potential. And just to kind of see, you know, the potential for cost reduction is absolutely massive. You know, you could see costs below $50 per kilowatt hour if some of these plans would come to fruition. And if history is a teacher, is a precedent, some of these costs seem pretty likely in the future. Moving on to the next slide, and I'm going to walk through this really quickly here. So beyond price, it's important to see how multiple other factors such as costs, energy density, specific energy, and cycle life will play a huge role in determination of which battery type is used in which application. I don't want to walk through each of these technologies, but just in terms of how to read this graph, outermost edges imply a higher score. So if you see a cost parameter that's on the outer edge, that essentially means that particular technology can achieve significantly lower costs in the future. So, you know, all of these technologies that we surveyed have different attributes, and we see that they could be deployed in different applications. Moving on, so what does that mean for regulators here, especially on the electric side in the US? We're already starting to see how costs of solar and storage bids coming in from Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, and some of the other states here in the US are starting to plummet quite significantly. We did some initial modeling for clean energy portfolios for 2025. Clean energy portfolios composed of solar, wind, demand response, efficiency, and storage. And what we predict is that by 2025, you could start seeing economics of clean energy portfolios significantly compete with combustion turbines and combined cycle plants. And that increased delta between the costs would be very, very essential in kind of nudging utilities and regulators and planners away from current plans for these gas plants. And then what does that mean for regulators? So I talked a little bit about diverse value streams for storage technologies. So I think what we need to do, at least from a modeling perspective, is have models that can span multi-year planning and sub-hourly operational characteristics. Just because current models are not built in a way that can account for these specific value streams that storage can provide. I believe that one of my co-panelists will be talking a little more about these modeling methodologies. But the second point that I really want to stress on is delayering of electricity system services, which essentially implies that we might want to slice the load curve, especially during hours of peak system requirements, into some layers that correspond to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 hour requirements, each of which can be catered by different battery and storage technologies with advantages and niches to meet those types of requirements. And the second one that I want to talk about here in this slide is around technology neutral approach. We've seen that ISOs across the country have filed their responses in response to FERC 841. And several ISOs have come forward by specifying pretty strict compliance rules for what type of storage technologies they'd like to see, especially around duration of discharge. So the recommendation here is to be more agnostic and more neutral and think about the outcomes instead of the operational characteristics of storage technology so that you can allow more types of storage technologies to come on. And the last slide here, just to kind of sum it up for all of us. Can we switch to the next slide? Thanks. So just to kind of wrap it up, one, we believe that step changes in cost and performance of battery technologies are fairly likely. I give a couple of examples here around how solid state might be able to hit $50 per kilowatt hour, or how other technologies can hit 10,000 plus cycles. The second thing here is that while the timeframes and pathways for these technologies to commercialization differ quite significantly, they are likely. The technologies that we surveyed, some of them were close to, ready to be scaled up. Others were in the prototype stage, but there's significant diversity, and the role that public policy folks, as well as private investors and utilities, can play in moving these technologies further along is quite significant. Then thinking a little bit about the ecosystem of batteries, we think that there's huge complementarity and diversity of battery technologies, and it's likely that these technologies could be deployed in ways that serve specific needs at different times of operation. And last, just thinking a little bit about the system-wide implications, which I talked about on the first slide, that how beyond the product itself, batteries are likely to have implications across multiple sectors of the economy. And what that means is that batteries are essentially critical in meeting our decarbonization needs if we have any chances of hitting 1.5 Celsius goals. With that, I am going to pass it back to Mr. Chairman. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions as they come along. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Aman. Just as a reminder and a plug, audience members, please send your questions in. We have a couple in the queue now, but please feel free to send them as the presenters are going through their material. Next up, we have Jeremy Twitchell. He's an energy research analyst at Pacific Northwest National Lab, where he leads the Equitable Regulatory Environment area of PNNL Energy Storage Program and assists in distribution planning research. In those roles, he's responsible for reaching out to states to provide technical assistance in analyzing energy storage and other developing energy resources and incorporating them into utility planning procurement activities. Very glad to hear that he's also former staff with the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission, so he knows what all of us grapple with in our roles here. And he was a staff lead for development of policies associated with the treatment, energy storage, and utility resource planning and rulemaking. So clearly, he's highly qualified to speak to us this morning on this topic, and everyone, we look forward to hearing your thoughts and perspectives, Jeremy. So please go ahead.
All right, thank you for the kind introduction. Yes, the lab hired me because I speak regulator, which makes me a bit of an odd duck at the lab, but it's always nice to get back out and be with my people, be with my fellow, at least former fellow regulators, and talk about these issues. So I will be speaking today about some work we've been doing recently to look at how energy storage is treated in current integrated resource plan efforts, the way that the practice and the protocols are going. But first off, I just want to point out that all of the work that I'm presenting today has been funded by the Department of Energy through the Office of Electricity under the leadership of Dr. Amerjuk. And as always, we are very grateful for their continued support of the activities we do here at the lab. So the agenda today, I'll just be talking, just give a brief overview of the energy storage program at the Department of Energy, then talk about some of the basics of energy storage modeling, fundamental principles that we need to keep in mind. And then we'll move on to the integrated resource planning process and how the conventional process, the conventional models we use create a lot of barriers for energy storage modeling. And then finally, we'll move on to some of the emerging planning models, what we're seeing utilities and states develop to get around some of those barriers. So the energy storage program at DOE, it comes out of a 2013 report that identified a four-pronged strategy for supporting energy storage development. The first is in the area of technology development. This is better materials, better chemistries, new forms of energy storage, validated reliability and safety. This is making sure that the technology is safe, that it's that there's independent analysis confirming that it does what it says it's going to do. The equitable regulatory environment, that's where I work. This is where we're trying to identify the barriers that exist to energy storage and traditional regulatory and planning models, and trying to identify better ways of doing things. And then finally, industry acceptance. This is demonstration projects, economic analysis, helping utilities, helping regulators and policymakers get comfortable with how energy storage works, how the economics work, and things of that nature. So just a quick map of where we're engaged. It's a pretty diverse program. We've got partnerships with utilities across the country, with universities conducting research on the program's behalf. We have direct engagements with a few regulatory agencies and states to help them sort through some of these issues as well. Next slide, please. So the basics of energy storage modeling. So the key principle to keep in mind when you're looking at the values of energy storage is to remember that those values vary pretty significantly by location. So what you're looking at here is a graph that some of my colleagues at PNNL put together recently, where they did basically a massive literature review looking at all the energy storage economic analyses that they could find across the country, and looking at how these different values stacked up across the country in various parts of the grid. And as you can see, there's there's a pretty wide variation, not only in terms of what energy storage can do, but also in terms of what the value of those services are at different parts of the grid, different parts of the country. And our understanding of how all these services interact with one another and how their values change by location, as you can see, is growing. But what this does indicate is that, when you're talking about analyzing energy storage, planning for energy storage, it requires a much more deliberate and granular analysis than what we're used to doing with resource planning. Traditionally we're looking at a resource and saying, we need generation, we need capacity, we need energy. Where on the transmission grid will something fit? But as you can see with energy storage, we have to ask a lot more deliberate questions up front. You have to look at, okay, what do I want this device to do? What are the services that I need on my grid? Not just energy and capacity, but also ancillary services, black start, resilience, whatever they may be. But having a deliberate analysis that identifies what you need the device to do up front, and then that will inform not only the type of technology that you select, but also how big it needs to be and where you need to put it. Next slide, please. So as we're looking at all these different values, this is just kind of a representative analysis that we put together. That first line that you see is the energy price, basically the market energy price that a storage device would see, a simulated energy price. And that second row, arbitrage only, that's what the device will do in the arbitrage only case, where it's just being told to buy low, sell high. And that third case, we've added balancing. So we're allowing the device to provide frequency response reserves, regulation reserves. And then in that fourth case, we've added, we've assumed that there's a local distribution line where you see in that green circle, if we allow the device to discharge on a specific feeder at a specific time, we can delay or potentially displace an investment in the distribution system. And then in that final case, we've added a real power application where we're allowing the device to provide some volt bar service. But the takeaway here is that as you layer on all these different services, as you allow the device to pursue these different values, the way that it functions, the things that it does will change pretty significantly. And the key takeaway to look at is that second row, arbitrage only, and compare that to the last row where we have all the services in there. And that arbitrage only case has pretty much disappeared. And that's pretty consistent with what we've seen. Generally speaking, in the analyses that we've done, that we've reviewed, this arbitrage only, this classic time shift application for energy storage generally tends to be a pretty low value. Of course, there are exceptions, but in general, it's a pretty low value. It represents a pretty small fraction of the overall benefits that an energy storage device can generate for the grid. Next slide, please. So, summary again, when you're evaluating energy storage, you need a much more detailed methodology than what we've historically done in resource planning. You need to look at the siting and the sizing of the energy storage device. Again, what do you need it to do? What type of device, what size of device will best provide those services? And where can you put it to maximize the value of those services? You need to look at a broad set of use cases, considering all the things that the device can do. Not only considering all it can do, but reflecting or capturing the trade-offs, because energy storage can do a lot of things, but it can't do all the things at once. So you need a model that can look at what are the highest values and how can we optimize the device around those values. Regional variation, of course, considering the impacts of different market structures that the device may face. Utility structure, if you are in a vertically integrated utility, what are the transmission needs of the utility? What are the values created through the rates and tariffs of the utility? Things like demand charges, time of use rates. And then finally, battery characteristics. This is a developing area of research that we're putting a lot of effort into. What we've learned from these early deployments in energy storage is that the way you use a device, particularly a lithium-ion device, has pretty significant impacts both in the short-term performance of the device as well as the long-term useful life of the device. And so what we're trying to do is capture and understand what those impacts are, how the device changes under different use cases, and capturing those impacts in the modeling that we do. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've established some basic principles to keep in mind with energy storage modeling. Now I want to talk a little bit about why IRPs aren't very good at addressing some of these issues. And just for starters, I do not mean to belittle the IRP process in any way. Resource planning is an incredibly complex exercise. You know, the point of resource planning is to make sure that we can keep load and balance, load and demand and, load and generation in balance at all times. And if you think about it, that's incredibly complex. Not only are we dealing with, you know, thousands, millions of different individual customers in some cases, but we're also dealing with dozens of variables on the generation side. We've got different generators, we've got market interfaces, we've got fuel costs. You know, so for every interval that this planning model is trying to resolve load and generation, it's considering, you know, dozens of highly complex variables. And if you've got just, you know, a standard 15-year plan looking at hourly intervals, you're talking about 131,000 data points. So if you want to increase the resolution to capture some of these granular sub-hourly benefits of energy storage, you know, you're talking about even just going to a 15-minute model, you've created almost 500,000, more than 500,000 data points. You've also added significantly more complex variables to make sure that you're capturing how these devices function at that sub-hourly level. So, you know, it's not an easy exercise. So what we do historically with our IRPs is we make a number of simplifying planning assumptions to make this all work. We keep it to an hourly planning resolution. We substitute robust reserve margins for ancillary services. We don't try to optimize the model for frequency response, for spinning reserves, for all these different services. You know, we just have a robust reserve margin to make sure that there's reserve generation that can provide those services as needed. And then we focus on generation only. We don't plan the distribution system in the IRP, and there's limited, if any, transmission system planning as well. Next slide, please. So going back to that stacked value graph that we were looking at, you know, that arbitrage only case, that's going to be the only case that's going to be captured in a traditional IRP model, you know, this buy low, sell high approach. But all these other values, all these other services aren't going to be captured in that traditional model. It's not going to see ancillary services. It's not going to see distribution deferral. It's not going to see real power optimization. And so the challenge you end up with in a traditional IRP model is that you've captured all the costs of energy storage. Those are readily apparent, and you've captured those in your modeling, but you've run it through a model that is capturing only a fraction, in many cases a small fraction of the benefits. And in that regime, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for an energy storage device to appear cost effective. Next slide, please. So one thing we've done at PNNL, we recently did a look at 21 recent IRPs from across the country, and we've got a forthcoming report that actually went to the editors this morning, so hopefully will be out by the end of the month. But what we asked was, okay, given these challenges, given these limitations for energy storage, how are utilities around the country adapting to that? And so just high-level findings, 15 of these 21 IRPs that we looked at did include battery storage in their process. And of those 15, I need to amend this. We actually updated the report yesterday. So 9 plans did not select battery storage. 4 plans selected batteries in their preferred portfolio, and 2 plans selected it in an alternate portfolio. I apologize for that. And then we also looked at how pumped hydro storage is being treated in that. And what we found is that 10 of the 21 utilities were looking at pumped hydro storage. Of those 10, 7 plans did not select pumped hydro. 2 plans did include it in their preferred portfolio, but those were expansions of existing facilities. They were not new builds. And there was 1 utility that had a new build in an alternate portfolio. Next slide. So one of the interesting things that I took away from this work that we did was that utilities are still relatively uncertain when it comes to how much a battery device costs. What you can see here is that for the cost assumptions that were disclosed in the IRP process, you know, you had a pretty tight margin on the combustion turbine assumptions and the pump storage assumptions, which you'd expect. These are mature technologies that utilities have a lot of experience with. But when you look at the battery technologies, lithium-ion and flow, there's a much wider range of cost assumptions, suggesting that, you know, utilities are still very uncertain about how much these devices actually cost. Next slide, please. Another interesting thing we found is that, you know, as utilities included more services in their modeling their model, they were much more likely to select energy storage. I actually updated this graph as well yesterday. I apologize for this, but the takeaway is that the trend line that you see there actually got a bit sharper. That as you include more utilities, more services in your model, utilities were significantly more likely to select energy storage. In that group of 3 to 4 services, there's only 1 utility that selected it. And in that group of 6 to 8 services, there's 3 utilities, which was 60% of that sample size. So just again, the key takeaway is that as these additional values of energy storage, as these additional benefits are considered in the model, reflected in the model, you become much more likely to identify cost-effective opportunities for energy storage because, again, your model already has all the costs in it. And as you build up those benefits, as you identify those additional benefits, you're more likely to even the scales. Next slide. So emerging planning models. So again, given these challenges, given these constraints, what are utilities doing around the country to address them? And a few things that we've identified, a few practices. First is this net cost approach that Portland General Electric developed in their 2016 IRP. And what this does, essentially, it just takes the energy storage device and it runs it through a separate model, a model that's capable of identifying what all those sub-hourly benefits are, those granular benefits that aren't going to be captured in the IRP model. Then they take the net present value of those benefits and they come back to their cost assumption for the regular IRP model. And they just subtract those net benefits from the assumed cost assumption for the battery. And so what that does essentially is that it kind of forces those additional values into the modeling process. Even though they're not being directly modeled head-to-head against other resources, they are being accounted for in some way. Another adaptation that we're seeing is the move towards sub-hourly planning models. So this is where a utility is essentially replacing their entire, or beginning to replace their entire IRP model that has been looking at resources on an hourly basis with something that can do it on a sub-hourly basis. We haven't seen a utility that's done that on a wholesale basis yet, where they've moved the entire process to that. But what we have seen are utilities like Puget Sound Energy in Washington, where they're basically using the traditional IRP model, and when they get their portfolio at the end, they're running that portfolio through a sub-hourly model, and then they'll add in a flexible resource like a battery, and they'll run that portfolio again through the flexible model, and then that difference in the costs and benefits in the 2 runs they attribute is the flexibility benefit of the battery. You know, and this is important to note, you know, we're not just talking about storage here. Storage has kind of been the catalyst for utilities to rethink planning models, but it's a lot bigger than storage. This has implication for demand response programs, distributed generation integration, for utilities out west, the energy imbalance market, you know, looking at how do you interact with a market that's trading on a 5-minute basis. Another thing utilities are doing is integrated distribution system planning. And that's where they're basically coming up with a mechanism to incorporate what they do, to incorporate the distribution system planning and the resources that are being selected there and reflect those resources in the resource planning process. Next slide, please. So I already spoke about this. This is just an example of the Portland General process and how they do that net cost approach. And just as examples of that kind of external model that can do the storage analysis to identify those net benefits, we have the battery storage evaluation tool at PNNL, and EPRI has developed a storage vet tool that can do this type of analysis. Next slide. Sub-hourly planning models. I'm running short on time, so let's just go ahead and move to the next slide. So integrated distribution system planning, you know, this is a tricky undertaking. What you can see on the right there is a complicated flow chart of what this might look like. You know, but the idea really is just identifying on your transmission and distribution system where are opportunities for a device like energy storage to provide a deferral benefit or to provide some other service, And then how can we take that device that's providing this service and then include it in the integrated resource planning process to figure out, what other benefits, what other services can it provide? And I've provided links to a few examples of where this is happening. Next slide. So here, just a few more resources if you're interested in learning about what we do at the storage program at Sandia National Lab, at PNNL, a few other resources as well. And with that, I look forward to the conversation. Thanks again for having me.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Next up, we have Nitin Goldberger. She's going to give us an overview of work going on throughout the states and Energy Storage Association's perspective on that. Nitin is a state policy director for ESA. She drives and designs storage policy through regulatory and legislative advocacy at the state level. Before her current role, she served as Borrego Solar Director of Policy and Business Development for California. She advised and shaped Borrego Solar's business strategies and product offerings in California. Before that, she worked as a renewable energy policy expert for Pacific Gas and Electric. She's also worked as an associate with the Eurasia Group, advised corporate financial government clients on U.S. federal and state level natural gas, oil, electric power, sector policies. So no further ado, Nitin's up, and we look forward to seeing the work that ESA has going on throughout the states.
Thank you, Chair Griffin, and hello, everybody. And I'm going to try and give a broad overview of what's been going on at the state policy level for energy storage recently. I'll give a quick overview and then hope that if there are areas that folks want to dive into deeper, that we'll save that for the Q&As. And also, I'd like to caveat that this is obviously not an extensive list, so if your state is doing things, working hard on policies, I apologize if they're not included in the slides, but recognize that this is supposed to be capturing some of the key policy themes and trends that we are seeing across the states. Just a quick introduction of the Energy Storage Association. We're the National Trade Association for Energy Storage. We represent companies who are deploying energy storage. We have 170 members. They are very varied in terms of membership type, from utilities to independent power producers, manufacturers, and developers. So a great group of member companies. The next slide just shows a couple of logos. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I'll quickly talk about what ESA calls our policy menu of options, meaning the menu of options that state policymakers have to open up the energy storage market in their state. And they really revolve around three categories of hurdles that we see, both in terms of regulatory and market hurdles for energy storage at the state, and they are value, competition, and access. And I'll go through and talk a little bit at a high level about what states are doing. Some of these policies have been touched on in the previous presentations and will be probably in the next presentation. So I'll be brief, and we can have a better conversation afterwards. Next slide, please. So just to ground everybody and introduce you all to a report that we have available, it's the state menu of options. It looks at the suite of options of policies that policymakers have to choose from and provides a description of what those policy levers are and why they help in advancing energy storage. I'll note that the combination or the formula of different policies that each state chooses is very specific to the state. It has a lot to do with the regulatory landscape. Is the state restructured or vertically integrated, whether there's availability of funds to stimulate the market or not, and also wholesale market considerations. Is the state in an ISO, and how does the division of responsibilities between the regulator and the ISO or RTO, the wholesale market play out? Next slide, please. The menu of options focus on three regulatory hurdles, and you'll hear me talking about these a lot, so I'll just ground everybody with the three types of hurdles that I'll be referring to in this presentation. value is number one, right? Making sure that there are mechanisms for storage assets to provide the values we know they can and be compensated for them. Competition, Jeremy talked a lot about this in terms of integrated resource planning reforms, but is the technology able to compete against traditional investments in utility, specifically in utility planning processes, but also in wholesale market roles? And then lastly, access. Can the energy storage asset be able, is it able to interconnect onto the grid? Is it able to interconnect onto the grid and provide all the applications and services that it can provide? So next slide, please. Let's talk about what states are doing based on those three categories. I'll start with the value categories, what policies are being done. A number of states, 8 to be exact, have embarked on a cost-benefit study. These cost-benefit studies are in various levels of completion. There are 3 currently ongoing that we expect in the next couple of months. Importantly, these cost-benefit studies provide a statewide economic modeling that helps a state understand what the benefits and the costs of various deployment scenarios of energy storage are. They generally include, or importantly, they should include both distribution level and bulk system modeling. And then these results often help shape next steps for policymakers, namely the development of storage deployment targets and different programmatic elements to support those targets. In the next slide, please, I'll show what some of these reports can demonstrate. They can model various scenarios and stack the dollar value of the benefits and the dollar value of the costs until you can understand better what the costs are of different scenarios and what the benefits are, so that you can optimally choose a deployment scenario that where the benefits exceed the costs. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, many of these studies, namely in Massachusetts, New York, and Nevada, have led to deployment targets, and New Jersey is currently studying the cost-benefit analysis and already has a storage target in place thanks to legislation from last year. So this slide is really supposed to capture all the different states that have developed storage deployment or procurement targets and goals, and where they are in terms of the planning stages. So you can see that Nevada and Arizona are both states that are currently exploring storage targets. Nevada issued an order in December demonstrating that storage targets are in the public interest, but the number is still under development. Then just to reiterate the importance of targets, these provide long-term certainty in terms of the policy direction that the state is taking. They vary very much between states in terms of what the target includes in terms of eligible technology, what processes those targets are using to actually procure or secure the procurement of storage and deployment of storage, but they all are a very important signal in terms of the long-term viability of storage market in the state. Next slide, please. Similarly, and some of these states, in part driven by the cost-benefit studies, which give you an understanding of the value in terms of dollar benefits, but also through legislation and government or state initiatives, 5 states have various levels of energy storage incentive programs. These programs are largely focused on behind-the-meter resources, but not always. New York has recently put forward a bulk incentive program to facilitate procurement that's being done by the utilities. And these often are catered towards projects that are co-located with with renewable energy resources, but not always. I'll note that Maryland has a first of its kind tax incentives, while the rest are focused on rebates or adders to a PV rebates, PV production incentive program. Next slide, please. So we'll move into the category of competition, things that state policy actions that are being taken to break down barriers to competition to allow energy storage technologies to be better able to compete with traditional investments on utility planning processes. This includes bulk system-wide planning processes like the integrated resource planning process that Jeremy has talked a lot about. Also, the non-wires alternatives for distribution level planning and non-wires alternatives for transmission planning. I'll just call out on the slide that you see in front of you. These are the states that are really taking initiative to reform their integrated resource planning rules to better incorporate energy storage consideration along the lines of the kinds of best practices that Jeremy mentioned in the previous presentation. And I'll also call out the work being done at NRRI and with a task force that's underway to better dive into this. So there's a lot going on the IRP front. Next slide, please. And this is not a comprehensive list by any sense, but this is a matrix of states that have done important work on advancing distribution resource planning processes to better incorporate considerations of distributed energy resources, including energy storage. Some of them are just exploring and looking into ways to better develop access to data on the distribution system and understanding of what the needs are, all the way to states that are deploying pilots and solicitations for non-wires alternatives where storage assets can defer investment on the distribution system and save ratepayers dollars. So much work is going to continue to be done here in this space as states break down barriers on the distribution level. Next slide, please. And then lastly, in the competition, there are a number of states who are considering ways to fold in consideration of energy storage into existing renewable energy programs, including the Renewable Portfolio Standards. I'll note that Arizona and Massachusetts are considering a Clean Peak Standard program. Notably, the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources is currently issued a staff proposal to further develop a Clean Peak Standard that was in legislation last year. I'll note that the Clean Peak Standard is an interesting market-based solution to drive energy resources to periods of high cost and peak periods where there's high demand, and our very innovative approach. The key issues to think about is how to consider standalone energy storage and eligibility of resources, and I think that there's a lot of work and thought leadership to be done here in this space. Next slide, please. So the last couple of slides are in the access category, in facilitating access for resources, the energy storage resources. Multiple use application frameworks are very important. They are the benefits of allowing an energy storage asset to provide various applications from the same asset are obvious to most, but it's not only about saving ratepayer dollars by allowing the same asset to provide multiple services and benefits using the same rate-based asset or same asset, but also because the more revenue stream that an asset can capture, an energy storage system can capture, the better the economics and the more systems that will be deployed. So I'll call out that New York and California are really at the forefront of creating working groups at the regulatory level to think about ways to overcome any hurdles that there might be for the same asset to provide multiple applications. And I'll also call out that in Maryland, a bill that passed just last month, House Bill 650, creates a pilot program to test out these very kinds of commercial and regulatory models. Next slide, please. This graphic illustrates what I've just mentioned, which is every asset can provide a series of benefits, and the question is just whether or not they are able to provide those benefits from the same asset and then capture revenues for that. So that's just a graphical representation of what I just mentioned. And then lastly, next slide, please. Distribution interconnection, a very important piece, because No matter what kinds of policies are being implemented to drive deployment of energy storage in one state, if the energy storage systems cannot interconnect into the grid because of study timelines and upgrade costs are onerous or too expensive because they don't represent the actual expected behavior of the storage system, then you're not going to be able to see as many of the storage assets deployed onto the grid. And so updating distribution interconnection standards to better reflect the behavior of energy storage is critical. I'll note that Hawaii, New York, Nevada, and Arizona have all updated their interconnection standards to reflect energy storage system behavior and needs. All of them have many components that should be the gold standard for energy storage. And then many other states are in various stages of revisions to their rules and have engaged stakeholders in a very good and productive discussion, including Maryland, Minnesota, North Carolina, Colorado, and Michigan. Next slide, please. I think that's it for me, Chair Griffin, and thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to the questions.
Great, thank you very much. And last but not least, we have Clarice Schaefer. Clarice is our supervising utility analyst here at the Hawaii PUC. She was most recently part of the team that reviewed a series of power purchase agreements for some kind of record-breaking projects in our state, and I commend our team because we rethought our process and reviewed them in record time for our commission. So they've been very much deep in review of these projects in the past few months. But Clarice is also working part of teams on our performance-based regulation docket. With that, she's been a valued member of our team for several years now, and she'll present to you some of the current work that we're doing here at the Hawaii PUC.
Thank you, Chair. Aloha, everyone. I'm excited to share with you today about how utility regulation in Hawaii is working to ensure cost-effective integration of both distributed and utility-scale battery storage in our islands. So just as a quick disclaimer, any of the opinions that I may express in my presentation are my own and may not necessarily reflect those of the commissioners. Next slide. So just as a little bit of background, Hawaii's electric grids have unique system needs that battery storage can help satisfy. Hawaii has 6 independent island grids with no interconnection between the islands. Each island grid ranges in size from 5 megawatts of peak load on the islands of Molokai and Lanai up to about 1,200 megawatts of peak load on the island of Oahu. As more electricity is generated by solar and wind, and as we move closer to our 100% renewable portfolio standard, there will be growing capacity needs to respond to the timing imbalance between peak demand and renewable energy production. Grid services such as fast frequency response and regulating reserve will also be essential to ensure grid stability. Also, the utility is planning on retiring major fossil fuel generators in the next few years. The Hawaiian electric companies just completed the first phase of an ongoing competitive procurement process for renewable energy and storage across its service territories. So in the next phase of the competitive procurement process, we are anticipating bids for renewable energy paired with storage and also aggregated resources, some of which will have behind-the-meter storage and some of which may be standalone storage. We're expecting these storage services to replace many of the services that have been provided by fossil generators that will be retired. Next slide, please. So just as a little agenda, my presentation will focus mainly on 2 topics, including how the Commission is working to incent cost-effective adoption of distributed storage through distributed energy resource and demand response program and rate design. And the second topic of my presentation includes how market-driven procurements are accelerating grid-scale storage integration here in Hawaii. So in my next slide, I'll talk about Hawaii's distributed energy resources, or DER, and demand response, or DR, efforts. So it's really important for rate design and DER programs to keep pace with an evolving system. So in 2015, the Commission closed the net energy metering program to new customers in order to provide better incentives for grid-supportive DER. This was done mainly to mitigate grid integration challenges and to establish pricing for new programs that's more aligned with the economic value of DER resources. In 2015, the self-supply DER program was also created, and this allows customers fast-tracked interconnection of non-export DER systems. This tariff was designed to be flexible and adaptable to grid requirements along with evolving technologies such as storage. In 2018, a similar program was established to allow net energy metering customers to add non-export capacity to their home or business without affecting their NEM status. So in addition to these two self-supply programs, a smart export program was established in 2017 and features zero compensation during the midday, but enhanced compensation otherwise to reflect the exported energy's relative time-based value to the grid. So accordingly, this program allows customers to charge their battery storage from the rooftop systems during the daylight hours and then use that energy to power their home in the evening. These customers may also export power if they have the extra capacity to do so. Also in 2017, a controllable direct-to-grid DER option was also created. So interestingly, as Chair Griffin mentioned earlier, after these post-NEM programs were initiated, in the last year, about 3/4 of the distributed solar installed in Hawaii has actually been paired with storage. For the next point on the slide, I'll introduce a bit about Hawaii's demand response efforts. So the Hawaiian electric companies recently contracted with a third-party aggregator, which would allow the utility to acquire grid services from aggregated DER, namely fast frequency response and capacity. So these services will mostly be provided by commercial and industrial customer storage, but also water heating is proposed to provide some fast frequency response. The Commission we're currently reviewing this contract, and the Hawaiian electric companies are also going out for a second phase of procurement for grid services later this year. So the Commission also just approved the utility's grid modernization plan, which will support advanced meter rollout and more advanced rate structures at scale. I'd just like to point out that it's not only meters that the Commission approved for the grid modernization plan, as the plan also includes new software for data management and control of DER, in addition to important telecommunication infrastructure, which enables sensing, communications, and control, for example. So this software I'd like to mention that this software will also be in addition to the computer software system that the Commission approved a couple years ago, which the utility plans to use as a platform to manage demand response resources. So for the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about grid scale storage. So like I mentioned on my first slide, the Commission has been overseeing a competitive procurement effort for renewable dispatchable generation. Last month, like Chair Griffin mentioned, the Commission approved 6 power purchase agreement contracts for renewable dispatchable generation on 3 islands. The projects include 247 megawatts of solar PV and almost a gigawatt hour of storage. Also, like Chair Griffin mentioned earlier, these are not the first grid-scale renewable projects that have been paired with storage in Hawaii. KIUC, our island utility cooperative on the island of Kauai, was the first, they employed the first fully dispatchable solar plus storage project, which became operational over 2 years ago. And then also, there have been several wind projects over the past decade that have employed storage to support grid stability and also renewable integration. However, I'd like to point out that the contract structures for these 6 projects that we just approved are the first of their kind in Hawaii and are different than past must-take as available renewable energy power purchase agreements. So the main difference with these contracts is that they include a monthly fixed lump sum payment, which you could say is similar to a capacity contract. So this provides stability to both the project owner and to ratepayers. These contracts also eliminated the seniority curtailment provisions that have been part of past contracts, as these 6 projects are fully dispatchable with no minimum dispatch limits. Also, I'd like to point out that the contracts include 5 metrics that are used to evaluate PV system dispatch availability and efficiency, along with the battery energy system storage discharge ability. These performance metrics, they not only provide cost savings to the ratepayers if they are triggered, but they also ensure that the ratepayers are not paying for a PV or a battery energy storage system that can't fully provide their expected energy and capacity. So these projects have an equivalent pricing of about 8 to 10 cents per kilowatt hour, and this is compared to the average cost of fossil generation, which is about 15 cents per kilowatt hour. And accordingly, these projects provide notable customer bill savings. I just want to draw your attention to this trend in pricing. So over the past few years, solar plus storage project prices have gone from 14 cents to from those first KIUC projects that I mentioned, down to 10 cents, and now down to an equivalent 8 cents per kilowatt hour. This is a very favorable pricing trajectory for this technology. And I want to point out that we're not just talking about PV systems with just a few minutes of storage anymore. These are systems that include 4 to 5 hours of storage, which is a lot of storage to be paired with renewable energy. And we're hoping that this pricing will continue down this path. I'd also like to point out that the production of energy from these 6 projects will contribute to the avoidance of nearly 3 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions for their contract terms, which are 20 to 25 years. For my last slide, I'm going to be providing a brief overview of several proceedings here in Hawaii in which the impacts of storage technologies are being considered. So last week, in response to Commission guidance, the HECO companies issued their Phase 2 draft request for proposals for dispatchable and renewable energy. A primary focus of the competitive procurement process will be to replace energy and services from Hawaii's largest existing fossil generators, as I mentioned earlier in my first slide. Second, for the community-based renewable energy program, the Commission has also recognized that the incorporation of battery storage is expected for the second phase of this program. So the compensation structure that's planned for the Phase 2 of the community renewable energy program will require peaker community renewable facilities to deliver at least 85% of their output during the on-peak time period. Third, for the integrated grid planning process, distributed and utility scale storage technologies are a major component of the electric company's planning. Fourth, in terms of Hawaii's performance-based rate regulation proceedings, Commission staff published a proposal earlier this year that discusses how storage could be integrated into the design of different utility performance mechanisms. Fifth, for the electrification of transportation, the Commission has had several docket proceedings on that matter. And then finally, for microgrids, the state passed legislation last year that directs the Commission to establish a microgrid service tariff to address resilience. And just on an ending note, I would like to emphasize that while we're planning for the deployment of all this distributed and utility scale storage, I really feel that the industry and government agencies need to contemplate and work together to figure out ways for how to repurpose, recycle, and properly dispose of all these different types of batteries out there. So that concludes my presentation. I just want to say mahalo for listening to me share about how storage fits into our regulatory efforts here in Hawaii.
Great. Thank you very much, Clarice, and thanks to all of our presenters. First, I want to make another call for questions from the audience. We have a number, which I'm going to pick up at the moment, but also want to just cast the net out again. So first, I want to pick up a question that came from a fellow commissioner. Since we have a regulatory audience, want to make sure we field the questions from decision makers in our audience. And I'll maybe try to paraphrase or recast the question a little bit and ask it the three of our panelists, Aman, Nitin, and Jeremy, and then maybe ask Clarice last. But the question is really about how can regulators, decision makers, how should we be thinking about this is a technology with rapid innovation, lots of potential change for the future. So we're in a position of having to authorize investments today, sign off on long-term contracts. So, how do we feel comfortable with signing off on these investments when we know that there's going to be continued change and innovation? And, it's a question of, do we wait and see, what future potential improvements are, or kind of what sort of, or maybe put it this way, what sort of contractual and decision guarantees do we look for to help insulate customers from some of this potential future change and risk? So let me cast that out to the first three, and then maybe Clarice can talk about some of the provisions of recent contracts we have that help address some of this.
Sure, and this is Aman. I can take first pass at that question. And thank you so much for asking that question. So again, I guess if precedent is any guidance, provides any guidance to how the future is going to be, costs are likely to fall pretty fast, even for storage. Clarice talked about how some of the contracts, even in the state of Hawaii, have fallen quite significantly over the last couple of years, and we're seeing similar trends across the country. So one thing that I may urge planners and modelers to think about is incorporate some sort of scenarios in whatever modeling exercises that are conducted to inform these decisions. Jeremy talked a little bit about net cost modeling approaches, IRP approaches, distributed system planning approaches, especially in the face of uncertainty around costs of storage. So as much as possible, I'd say let's think about at least a couple of scenarios that model the range of cost options available in the future. The other thing would be just think about what risk that presents to ratepayers versus shareholders, and how this risk should be suitably allocated between these two set of stakeholders, either based on new and innovative business models that think about procuring services instead of ownership of the asset itself, especially given the rapid innovation cycle in storage technologies. That would be another recommendation. So yeah, Jeremy, Nitin.
Hey, this is Jeremy. I just had a couple of quick thoughts. So, I talked a lot about how planning is evolving. I'm not as sure that we need to evolve entirely new regulatory models. Functionally, a regulator is just asking utility, did you demonstrate the need, and did you make a reasonable decision based on the information you had at the time? So, if the technology gets better and cheaper in the future, that's great. But I would suggest that, it's a case-by-case basis. And, if a utility comes with a plan, with a proposed investment that makes sense at this time, according to the regulations of, the given commission or the given state, then, those future considerations, maybe shouldn't be as much of a factor. Another point I want to make is that, we are in a time of significant transition in the utility industry. And, I hear in that question concern about stranded assets. One of the advantages of storage on this front is, if you have a storage device, you're talking about a 10-year asset versus a 40-year gas plant or something of that nature. So from that perspective of stranded costs, it is relatively more flexible, and that's something that should be considered as well.
This is Nitin. I couldn't agree more with what's been said already. I'll only add that to Jeremy's point, the key here is really just to make sure that the review of investment requires significant investigation of what the need is and the competitiveness of the resource. And given an opportunity to compete head-to-head, energy storage resources can, in many applications and in many needs, serve as a cost-competitive solution. And so the question is not, could it be cheaper, but is it cheaper than the alternative traditional investment? And that means for natural gas peaking plant proposals, transmission build-out proposal, distribution investment. So I think that that's really the key here. The other point I'll mention is that those cost-benefit studies are a really important toolbox in a policymaker's or tool in the policymaker's box, because they actually model out cost assumptions and cost declines, and they still get to a very clear description of a net benefit given those cost declines. So those cost-benefit studies that look at a 2030 deployment scenario already, if they have robust economic modeling, will factor in cost declines and still demonstrate a net benefit regardless.
I'd just like to add that in terms of the contract provisions for these major solar plus storage projects, that if the equipment is not capable of providing energy or services, it's up to the developer to be responsible for fixing or replacing this equipment for the entire 20 to 25-year terms of the contract. Also, I'd like to point out that we're trying not to contract for too much of any specific resource at a given period in time. So this could help mitigate some of the concerns about rapid technology advancements.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for your thoughts and perspectives on that. I'm going to combine a couple questions here and have us talk about full life cycle of these resources. Clarice brought up end of life, but we also had questions on supply chain of resources, particularly lithium. So I think there's a question from the audience on, how reliable is this? What are some of the factors in sourcing some of the materials? We also had another question on how to handle end of life, and Clarice brought this up, and something that our commission's been talking with California on. So I cast it out to the group, thinking more broadly about this resource. How should decision makers be thinking about the full life cycle of material extraction and what we're going to end up doing with these assets when they're done and retired? So maybe we'll go in the same order. Just curious to hear your perspectives.
Sure. Thanks, and this is Amin here. As far as materials sourcing is concerned, lithium, of course, gets a lot of attention, but analysis that has been done by several others talks about how there is ample lithium to cover demand over the next at least 20 odd years. With one material that is in existing batteries that has caused significant outcry is cobalt, especially for NMC and NCA batteries, price of which has been fairly volatile. And there's active technological innovation and R&D efforts on that side, just to try and reduce the amount of cobalt that is being included in lithium-ion batteries. As far as what decision makers might do, I wouldn't be able to comment much on the material side of things, but at least on the end-of-life perspective, there are coalitions that are forming across the world that try to create a circular economy for batteries as well, where manufacturers and developers and integrators have to take some responsibility for end-of-life services or end-of-life retrieval of battery materials as well as installments. So I think that there is something similar that could happen here in the US as well. I know that recycling hasn't quite taken off yet, primarily because of low volumes of batteries that are close to their end stages. But as volumes of batteries that are deployed across the country increases, and some of these batteries approach end of their life, recycling could be something that can be considered. But otherwise, several other private developers as well as governments are thinking a little bit about how batteries can be reused, either for grid services or for other applications at the end of their first life.
This is Jeremy. I'll just add a couple, snippets of what DOE and the labs are doing in this space. So at the lab level, at the R&D, we're trying to figure out how do you build batteries that don't rely as much on rare earth minerals. One particular area of focus is in organic flow batteries, developing flow batteries that don't require rare earth minerals. It's technologically feasible. We have batteries that can do that. Now it's just a question of how do you make them to the point that they can compete with existing technologies. Another point is that the Department of Energy in January announced basically a research prize for anyone who can figure out how you develop a recycling process for lithium-ion batteries, how you can make this commercially viable. These prizes have been very successful in the past. The first commercial LED light bulb came out of one of these competitions. DOE also set aside, I believe, about $15 million to set up a recycling facility at the Argonne National Lab. So definitely an area of focus in research and funding right now.
This is Nitin with the ESA. Similarly, it's certainly an issue that we as an association are focusing on with our member companies, and there's much work to be done ahead of us. I'd note that many of these elements are actually, or at least for the end-of-life portion, are incorporated into the contractual agreements. And so in terms of thinking through decision makers, I would imagine that that is an area to investigate and look at as you're seeing more contracts come your way.
Great, thanks. So I think it's also important to include in the product design more standardization to make it easier for products to be recycled. And I also think early implementation of trying to figure out ways to recycle and repurpose batteries is important, and this could be done through, say, extended producer responsibility. So making, say, producers of some of these products physically and financially responsible for the end-of-life management. And this could be done, taking a more proactive approach instead of a reactive approach. So taxpayers and ratepayers aren't funding ways to address this issue once the problem becomes so big.
Mr. Chairman, let me jump in for a second. This is Tom again, and we're right at the 3:30 time. If the audience wants to stay on a little longer and you want to stay a little longer, we can extend for a few minutes here. I want to just say thank you to everyone for participating. We still have almost 100 attendees still on the line now, so it's up to you if you want to continue with more questions. And then if people want to look at their screen, I have been showing ideas for the next sessions, both for NRRI and NRRI Center for Partnerships and Innovations webinars that are coming up in the next month or so. I want to repeat my invitation to people to send us their more questions about storage. I already received one set in the email to me, and we'll build that into a future session. I really appreciate everyone's interest.
I just want to echo that. I want to thank our presenters. Tom, as I understand it, the remaining questions from the audience we will distribute and get answers to. I know I can stay on the line for a few minutes more. I actually have a lot more questions. Like you guys have done great work. Appreciate your time, and people can stay. If not, please enjoy the rest of the day.
Okay, thank you so much. Go ahead with your next questions.
This was targeted at a comment in Jeremy's presentation on 17, talking about modeling, but it talked about co-optimization of distribution level resources with system needs, kind of as your emerging modeling planning practices. This is something that we're kind of heavily in the middle of here in Hawaii. I'd be curious just to see your thoughts on where this is being done well or how to do it well. I would also just add this, we're part of this joint task force with NRRI on planning, and almost every group there, I think this was a need identified. So I think the common thread is that this will be, increasing trend throughout the country of how their utilities and regulators think about this. So, just your thoughts and the rest of the group on how we better integrate these systems that have, very traditionally been separated. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I will do what I can with that. So I would actually point to Hawaii as a leader in this space. So I'm not sure I can really give you anything that will be ahead of where you're at. One of the fundamental questions you have to ask is, are you in a vertically integrated utility or are you in a market-facing utility? Because the way you go about this is going to be very different. Especially with recent orders like FERC 841, the markets are moving in this direction where they're trying to figure out how to allow these distributed resources to provide system needs. How do you incorporate that into the bidding process for the market? It's a little trickier in a vertically integrated territory. I'd point to the work you've done in Hawaii and what HECO did with their modernization plan. I think of that as really leading the nation. Minnesota has had a very long running and very deep proceeding on distribution system planning. I recommend looking at that docket if for no other reason that I can't think of anywhere else off the top of my head where you'll find such a deep resource on distribution planning. They've had multiple workshops with a lot of very intelligent people, and a lot of good stuff has come out of that. I would look at New York and the REV process. REV, reforming the energy vision, has become a lot of things. But if you go back to the core, the idea was how do we remake the grid in a locational level? How do we achieve resilience through distributed operations? And so a lot of the work that came out of REV, especially the early work, was really about how do you plan the system on a more granular level? How do you start at the local level, address local reliability needs, local resilience needs, and then roll that up into grid operations? So I would suggest looking there as well.
Any other thoughts from the other panelists? So I only had one more, just because I have you guys on the line, hopefully still. This goes to Aman's presentation, but I'd be curious to hear some of the other panelists' thoughts on slide 13. I think this was on the recommendations to regulators. The middle row talked about, I think it's the one right before this. Yeah. Okay. Technology. So this middle row, technology and neutral approach to regulation. You focus on the ISO rules in response to FERC 841. I'm just curious. I think there's a more generalized point here beyond just the wholesale market participation, because we have solicitations here where this is a question, and just I'm curious to hear more on how you think through this idea of designing regulations with key outcomes and requirements instead of operational attributes. You pointed to the requirements on duration of discharge. Can you just talk through, in more detail what sort of outcomes you think should be in there, and then also how do they have enough specificity that they become, enforceable in contracts? So I'm just curious on what, I think the general point's well taken, but how do you see this? How do you see operationalizing this in a broader context rather than just in these wholesale market participation rules?
Sure, I can offer some initial thoughts, but I appreciate the question. I think it's something that may require a little more work. So just reflecting on some of the responses that have come in through the FERC 841 order. So PJM has talked about that storage offering capacity would need to have about 10 hours of continuous energy supply. ISO NE has talked about a 2-hour supply, and New York is talking about a 4-hour minimum. So, and in addition, New England also talks about electric storage resources with 1 hour less of energy can only provide energy and not reserves. So I think these are kind of the examples that I'm alluding to when I talk about this recommendation. And again, if we're talking about a level playing field for all storage technologies, that results in the best, most cost-effective outcome for energy storage technologies, as well as best outcomes for the ratepayers. The suggestion specifically here pertains to removing those types of requirements. In terms of contracts, I think if we can link this point to the last point that I was making around delayering, where we can slice up the layers of the load curve based on what's the load that needs to be met on what's the peak that needs to be met on a 2-hour window, or a 4-hour window, or a 6 or an 8-hour window. That essentially allows you to get storage technologies that are optimized to meet those types of needs. And that could be one possible contractual structure that can help get to a more neutral regulatory approach. I'd also think that there might be other ideas, but I would love some input from others here as well.
Maybe Nitin, as I understand, you guys ESA has been active both on the FERC side, but and also these state markets. Any thoughts or perspectives that you have?
Yeah. I think that just at a high level, my thoughts are that ultimately the end goal is to provide an opportunity for a suite of energy storage technologies to serve every state, and those technologies will differ in terms of their capabilities and applications and durations, and ideally you have a mix of all of them. We've certainly been discussing on the wholesale market front, and also state regulators have been asking increasingly what the optimal duration is, and I think that the kind of high level answer is that Any of these decisions should be based on a robust analytic and modeling exercise in terms of what is needed. So rather than assuming that all assets on the grid need to be long duration, actually conduct modeling exercises to demonstrate what the combination, the optimal for various scenarios, right? So as more states are talking about a 50% or 100% clean energy goal, right? How do we develop the analytical underpinnings for helping us make those kinds of decisions about duration and the deployment scenarios? Hopefully that was helpful.
I thought it was very helpful. Jeremy, anything to offer? Also, I'm cognizant of people's time. I have plenty more questions to ask, but want to let everyone get back on with their day.
Yeah, just one quick thought I'll offer. So, when we're talking about technology agnostic, that means we have to really pivot to a much more needs-focused approach to identifying resource needs and procuring resource options. This, again, as I said before, this isn't just about storage, and storage is a wonderful tool that can solve a lot of problems, but it can't solve all the problems. And so what we're talking about is we've always taken a portfolio approach to resource planning. We've never expected one type of resource to do everything. And that's still the case. It's just that the kinds of questions we're asking, we're getting much more specific about the needs we're filling, because we have communication software, we have operational software that allows us to understand those needs much more granularly than we used to. We have technologies that can fill those needs in ways that the traditional technologies can't really do. So it's still about a portfolio. It's just we have to be much more deliberate about saying, okay, what exactly are the needs that we're filling? If it is just frequency response, a 15, 20-minute battery may be enough. If you're talking about meeting load, a capacity resource, maybe you do need 4, 6, 8 hours. If you're talking about deep decarbonization, then you're starting to talk about we need big, long duration storage, and pumped hydro enters the mix. So, if you want to be technology agnostic, you need to be very specific about what the needs are, what you're trying to fix.
Great, I appreciate that. I want to thank the group of panelists again for your time and thoughts. It's been great discussion, and I think I'll turn it over to Tom and let you close things out.
Okay, I want to thank everyone for participating today, audience and all the presenters, and thank you, Chair Griffin. We really appreciate this. Sorry we went over a little bit. We do create recordings now of the webinars, so commissioners and staff can get access after the fact. And we look forward to continuing this discussion in another webinar to go into even more detail about storage. So again, I invite everyone to send your questions. And Commissioner, you can send your questions too, and we will put together a plan for the next webinar. Thank you so much.
Mahalo.
Mahalo.